That's the other main reason I haven't got the paper written.
What,
cat
or anything?
This is now uploading to the web.
I have a new kitten, accidentally.
Oh.
Accidentally.
Yeah, turned up with my in-laws.
So you
And
couldn't
you're
turn
now
it away.
composing it with a cat ball.
Sorry?
No,
It does take up a lot of time.
Where so
Spencer-Oatey,
Is that your idea of an introduction?
Theories of Identity and the Analysis of Face, Journal of Pragmatics, paper 2007, pages 639 to 656, volume 3. You can laugh at me if you like, Sam, I don't mind. It is one of my roles in life.
Has anybody read it?
Yeah.
Has anybody not read it?
I have read it, but it was the fourth paper I read yesterday after Goffman and...
I've read it today, and it's the fourth paper I've read today.
Oh, God.
So did anyone think that, despite the fact that this seems to be trying to argue for a more sort of societal oriented view of face and identity, that in fact it ended up with quite an individualistic... I was quite foxed by this, because I thought it was saying all the right things, but where it ended up was actually back to that sort of individualistic model of the self, and I kept thinking, no, maybe I've missed something here.
What I felt was not quite that, but maybe it's about the same thing. Was that it started out with a really interesting question about the relationship between identity and face, and ended up being mostly about face.
Yeah, that's what sort of confused me. That's almost...
Is that because it is all about face anyway?
Especially like,
You can't get away
even in
from
the
it.
conclusion, there's no identities. It's all about. So this is what face is.
Yeah.
It doesn't
I
actually
wanted- I
mention
wanted
anything
a
about
conclusion
identity.
about identity.
Yeah. It's like, so conclusion. What are the difference? What is the relation? But
Well, maybe it really is about face, and that she's only stringing along identity to show in clearer perspective what face is.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yeah.
For me, this is very much a paper about affirming face, but drawing from paradigms outside of the traditional ones we've looked at in order to confirm it. So it's like, okay, great. So it's always good to confirm what we already know.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what it does, isn't it?
So just look at the way these stats work. Have you used these to where you find the key words on your PDF pages? Look, all the face words are on page 2 and 18. So, and then if you do identity, it's, I mean, there is actually quite a lot about the word identity.
So at the beginning
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah.
I wasn't sure how much the examples actually kind of really really elucidated.
I suppose maybe that's why she asked like what kind of data is actually needed for research into face.
I mean, they're interesting bits of data and interesting contexts, but
She has used them before.
right.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I can see.
I mean, we're all guilty of that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Particularly me. But I do think.
Name me
I
6 pieces of data.
She's never going to get away from that. Which actually leads to my comment on page 645. And the fact is that, I mean, Sarah said this at the last 645. But Sarah said this at the last LPRG that I was at, and she said that she's always suspicious of people using personal anecdotes. And
this example of the Hungarian.
Yeah. And she said, well, of course, except herself, which I fully agree with. I'm also suspicious of people using personal anecdotes, and yet I use them quite regularly. But
suspicious. I mean, I think they can be quite useful because in some ways, what we're doing with anecdotes is actually saying that we as people experience politeness, and I think there can be interesting things as long as it's sort of like I don't know, it's like a crystallisation of something
Mhm.
rather than, and this is all the data I've got.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can make good points with this, but
Yes.
I just thought the way she handled this, you know, you've got the British lady, not me, but British
Yeah,
lady.
it seems very odd until you get down to author's personal experience. You know,
Yeah.
it just feels it's almost like a kind of Julius Caesar's, you know, kind of referring to himself in the third person.
But
Yeah.
author's personal experience, from that I thought she had seen this.
Yeah.
No,
And then
it's,
she said,
it's her.
this-
Oh, I
I know,
Yeah.
I
know,
guessed
but
right
you
away
only
it
find
was
that out afterwards. This interchange was one that I personally experienced, and I thought, okay, so she's seen this happening. But then she says I, and I thought, God, that's such a weird way of handling
of
Yeah, yeah,
presenting it. Yeah.
It is an interesting stylistic way of doing it. I mean, yeah, I think would anybody else around the table have done that?
Well, I've just written, as it happens, just written a paper based on 3 anecdotes from personal experience, but I didn't handle it quite like that. I think I did just decide, I did have to wrestle with myself, but I think in the end I just decided, well, just come clean and say right from the start, this is me.
Well, I mean, Jim O'Driscoll did that as well with reflections on the FTA, the reflections on the conversation with Claudine, in a very interesting paper as well. So you're absolutely right. They can. I mean, I was being facetious, but personal anecdotes can in fact take us quite a long way. They can help us elucidate points that we might not otherwise be able to make, but which are valid and worthwhile nevertheless.
Well, my argument in the paper was that because of what I was talking about, which was indirectness, I had to get at whether people meant to be polite or not. And since I was one of the participants, I knew, that I knew what I was intending. And it just so happened that in one of the anecdotes that I had a discussion with the person that I was talking to about what each of us intended. So it was kind of, I mean, I'm not, I'm a great believer in observing behaviour in audio recording and all the rest of it. But in this case, it would have been difficult to make the argument that I was making without also having access to what those people were thinking when they said those things.
I think this aspect, this particular example, when the paper is about identity, I thought her take on identity was provocative. But I thought that this particular example actually demonstrates a certain level of ambivalence about identity, her own identity. One moment she's a British lady, the next minute she's the author.
Yeah.
Finally she's
good,
I. But the thing that bothered me about that particular example, which I think is present throughout the whole article, is that she's treating these aspects of her identity as if they only belong to her. So there's supposed to be this sort of social engagement, and yet she says, for me, old lady had negative connotations, without any recognition that actually old lady is age is a social construct, and attitudes towards age are a social construct. And this notion, and I can't remember where she says it, but she says people experience aspects of their identity in different ways. And I think, well, that's quite a privileged white person perspective. There are certain identities whereby you are allowed to experience your identity in any way you choose, and other identities that you can't. There's an element whereby all of it comes down to for me, this is what I felt. And I think if the person had turned around and said, you are a very kind black lady, there would be quite a different, there's quite a different, the idea that you can experience identity in any way you choose, I think, is a very privileged position rather than a universal position.
Is that what she says, that you can experience it in any way you choose? It's not quite the same as saying...
She says it at one point. Let's see if I can find it.
Not coming into those two key ones, personal experience.
But I mean, in that example, she doesn't actually explicitly point out that the reason. I mean, the reason that this exchange came about was because of a cultural mismatch. She doesn't actually use that term. I mean, she kind of hints at it, but she doesn't actually use this particular term. I mean, and this is.
And she doesn't use that for the Chinese data either.
No, she doesn't. There is there's a pragmatic, there's a pragmatic / cultural issue here in terms of how they kind of don't kind of gel onto one another. I mean, and what's interesting is that she says that she reacted with mixed emotions. I like Helen and I like Helen a lot, and I'm actually quite surprised because I've got students at my university who there's one section of students at my university that can get away with calling me Mr. Derek, right? And it's because they are Greek.
Not
right?
Dr. Derek.
No. Oh, Dr. Master, they call me Mr. Derek, and it's because they're Greek. And apparently, when they say Mr. Derek like this, it's a huge honorific point. But if any of the British students said it, because they would then consciously know that they're winding me up, then I would probably react with mixed emotions. But but because the Greek students do it, I don't respond with mixed emotions. But this might be because I already knew that Greek students, that it's a direct. My understanding is it's a direct holdover from Greek. In Greek they will say, Mr. and then your first name, rather than your family name. So I'm a little bit confused as to why, as a linguist, she says that she's reacting with mixed emotions. When she says she's reacting with mixed emotions in this example, she explains it as if she is not meta-aware of why that happened, and whilst we linguists are also lay users, as a lay user we cannot ignore the fact that we are linguists.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just the way she's expressed it. I can imagine that
at
moments like that,
Yeah.
you do both. You react as a layperson and you have the meta. So maybe she's just trying to.
And then you get your notebook out.
Exactly. Maybe that's exactly what she means. Is that with her linguist hat on, she knows it's fine, but but with her
just
middle-aged
British
white
person,
woman hat on.
But she doesn't.
She recognises that slight uncomfortableness with it, but is able to kind of meta.
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure she did, but it's just she does not say that in the follow-up. Paragraph.
It isn't expressed quite in that way.
Is she not describing the opposite to what you were talking about earlier, where you said that your 3-year-old called you Mr. Poopy Head or whatever she said?
Well, it wasn't Mr. but she just called me Poo Poo Head.
Okay.
Yeah, she didn't give me an honorific, but that's
but you knew she wanted to offend you, but it didn't have.
Yeah, because she's 3 and she's my daughter, and
and you kind of laughed it off. This is kind of the opposite situation, where
someone's trying to be nice.
Someone's trying to be nice,
and it's taken the wrong
way. It's almost, and it's. I've never really thought about it. It's kind of like this split between.
Mirror.
What is it with Jack and his mirror and in bed and his dog?
Well, I'll tell you with the pub later.
It's almost like a split between kind of like intention and effect, but knowing what the intention was, but having a different effect.
Oh yeah, there's no marriage between the two. It's basically, it's when you're speaking and what your perlocutionary effects you actually want. It's like trying to hit a moving target. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you won't.
That's
no
my
matter
point about the notion of aspects, particular aspects of identity. You don't get to control them. Poo-poo head doesn't have any bigger, broader cultural context, whereas age does in a Western context.
Yeah.
And just
in a lot of cultural context, but probably just differently.
Exactly,
values.
absolutely.
Exactly.
But my problem is that she adopted that as her thing that she experienced. And can I just the quote I was trying to find is on page 641.
Give me 2 key words and I'll find them.
Okay, superficially and ethnicity.
They go next to each other.
Yeah, that's the one right there.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay,
What
so
page is that?
641.
Just under the table.
Yeah. So the second full paragraph, this third sentence. Superficially, it may seem that certain characteristics have more collective potential than others, e.g., a person's sex, ethnicity, religion. But as Simon explains, in reality, it depends how people experience a given self-aspect. So all of it comes down to an individual's experience of an attribute of identity. And I think that's a privileged position to have, whereby...
Yeah, because my identity, what I think of as my identity, you might share some, but by no means all of the elements that I've got. You might have a different view of my identity.
But the other...
everybody around the room does.
I mean, by share, you mean we agree that those are your identity?
Yeah, but I mean, just plucking numbers out of the air, which is never a good thing. Your view of my identity and my view of my identity might only marry 60%.
74% might be
74% seems like a magic number, which some people might actually think is acceptable, and others wouldn't. So with this 74%, kind of match, it does mean there's a 26% which is questionable, unless of course you've got a parent, in which case they'll write in and complain.
But it's not just a question of whether you agree that that person has that, has that particular identity goal. It's about how it's evaluated, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because this whole thing about this guy thinking of her as old, I mean, he obviously thought old was a respectful term, perhaps, or maybe his English wasn't very good, I don't know. But, he didn't see that necessarily as, maybe he just thought she was old.
But I think there are...
But, for her, it was old and bad.
But I also think that there are certain identities that are structurally coded. So, for instance, the reason this is coming to mind is because I'm doing a lot of research on whiteness, and the notion of whiteness. I recently read a study, and I can't remember who wrote it, but I recently read a study where American university students were interviewed, and they were asked how salient their race is to them. And all of the white students said not at all, and the black students said, of course it is. They don't. It's not like a black student says, oh, well, I experience it differently than you. It's not a matter of their own personal experience. And I think it's problematic to say, well, we all experience it differently, because I think that's privileged. I think that's the privileged,
If you're in the dominant group, then you've got more choice as to how you experience things.
Exactly, And I think that's a thread throughout this paper that I think is problematic.
And it is down to that sort of individualistic experience of identity, isn't it? It's about, your take on the groups that you've been allocated in some ways, the bits of identity that belongs to wider social groups.
Oh, it is the case that there are certain things that you could make more central to your identity, and so perhaps religion, for example, in the kind of sort of secular culture in the UK, you can choose to make it an important part of your identity, or a fairly peripheral part of your identity. So there are, but I quite agree. I mean, things like.
But in other cultures where religion is
yes,
a key
exactly. Go and live in Iraq, and whether which particular type of Muslim you are, or whether
or
you're
go live in my
Christian
hometown in America and try to be an atheist.
Exactly. So those things aren't consistent. But so there are certain things which we do have more choice about. But and I think also gender a lot of the times one you can't escape.
But I think those things we have choice about are perhaps not culturally determined, but certainly not separable from structure, I guess.
Yeah. But I mean, I agree that it's kind of a rather simplistic dismissal of some quite important categories which are imbued with evaluation.
I also was quite surprised to see the notion of the relational self reduced to just being about the sort of things that you negotiate with the people that you're talking to, and that in some ways, I mean, I think if you take stuff like Voloshinov's view that it's about your individual identity is not constructed just in relation to the people that you're talking to, but is actually that to and fro movement between what you expect the people that you're with and the society, the group that you're in to expect of you. I mean, it's much more that. I thought, the bits where I've read about relational self have not been just about, well, you will determine, or I will determine myself in relation to what I think you want. I think the relation of self is much more complicated and much more, it's about the relation with the society rather than just the people that you're talking to.
Page is that?
It's 641. Bottom 641 is the first time I found relations.
Yeah, it says which represents a self-concept derived from connections and role relations with significant others. It's just as if my identity is constructed with the people I'm with, and I it's not.
No.
That's a very sort of localised view of identity, and that seems as if there isn't anything out there. It's all just a vacuum in here, and when I go out the door, I'll wait until I meet someone. before I have my
Right.
identity again. I just think,
Well,
clearly
no,
can't
because there's like the three different things there that she has. She's got the personal self, the relational self, and the collective self. So
Yeah.
the relational self will only be in those contexts, but then you still have the other types of self as well.
So is that the distinction between identity and face? Because I mean, we don't want to risk assuming that face is identity. But I mean, we had this discussion this morning. Face is, you know, when Tucker says that you don't have face, you just it's constructed in the interaction. But you do have identity while you're awake.
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean? So that is the so is
Doesn't she
face the
state somewhere
interactional
what she sees
element
as the difference?
of identity?
No, part of the difference, which
Right at the beginning.
so
Yeah.
after this meeting we've got a Gotham Appreciation Society, or whatever we call it, where we're talking about face work. And for the, whatever it was, the 15th time that I read this paper, it was only this time that I honed in on the definition of a face being about positive social attributes.
Yeah. Yeah.
That we don't ever have anything to do with face as anything bad about us, that I'm a sociopath or whatever it is. Part of my identity can be about negative traits. So there's
People will revel in that as well. You know, people will like the fact that they are feared and not being feared in certain situations. Am I feared? No, I'm not feared. But no, they will like.
not my estimate.
No, of course.
No, exactly.
No, by
But if you ever read my letter, I might be.
by students who turn up
Yeah.
74% of the time being feared. But no, it's just that, you know, if people like to be feared and would see their face, not consciously, but they might feel their face as a threat if they are no longer feared.
And therefore that's actually a negative attribute is a positive individual attribute.
Well, no, if you look at this from a kind of a societal perspective, I mean, the Soviet Union, if all of the information that we got during that kind of Cold War period is believed, they liked to be feared. They've gone on.
But
I mean,
isn't that about, you know, a positive attribute, which
For
is
them.
being which
But
is not
it-
about being feared, but it is about being in control, being in power.
so
I mean,
that's-
wouldn't you have to sort of switch it round and make it into a positive attribute?
So
Isn't
again,
that
so
because
what's positive, what's
of the
negative?
culture we're in values democracy?
Whereas
level.
they value
Yeah.
strength and
Exactly.
And the
It's just
status quo and
Yeah.
security.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because what Goffman is, I mean, the thing I feel that she might be missing about what Goffman says about face, and it might be in the article that I'm not going to be discussing this afternoon because I won't be there, but he says it's the thing that makes society work. If we all have emotions attached to our face, then that's the thing that makes society run smoothly. And so in the West, if we can all have emotions attached to this individual God, as he calls it, then Western society will work okay. In a different society, different configurations will work with face.
Well, maybe there's another point of departure, or at least distinction between the two, is this we affect our face. We have emotional attachment to it. And there are certainly aspects of my identity which I really don't care about. Right? I know I have no dress sense, that I always pick the shirtless, the trousers and whatever it is at the top of the pile. I don't choose what goes
Yeah,
together.
but you object to other colour pairs of trousers.
So what?
You object to other colour pairs of trousers.
I don't
on
wear other
himself.
pairs of trousers.
Yeah, that's what she's saying.
because
You
I
object
remember,
to it, you
but
don't
I'd never really noticed the fact that you always wear the same colour pair of trousers.
It's always this stony.
Yeah, and
brown or-
Sally had bought you a pair that was just a
Dark
slightly
brown.
different.
Oh, I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah, and he spent the whole day complaining it just wasn't right.
Yes.
So actually, he does.
Right, okay. I can take this to music. I can like things and not like things. I can go to opera or I can listen to hip hop. But I don't have emotional attachment.
But here's the thing. This really bugs me. Page 641. If you want to see the thing that bugs me.
What about it?
First full paragraph under the table in 641. Yeah. For all of us. Sentence 2. We evaluate certain aspects of ourselves positively, we dislike other aspects, and we are neutral about yet other aspects. The very idea that I divide myself up into different aspects of myself and decide to evaluate some of them positively and some of them negatively, to me is capitalism working on me in the extreme. You like this, you don't like that, you can buy this to fix that. You see what I mean? I think, it's like you might as well divide up my body and say, ooh, I don't like my hips, but I like my thighs.
No, I don't have the problem because I don't know. It's kind of how I think So I know there are some things I do well, and I know there's some things, time management is not my forte. That's
well, can I then sell you my time management package?
No, actually.
I can afford it, I'd have one. Yes, please.
Yeah, well, but so I don't see it. I suppose I don't tie it up in quite that way. But I can say there are things I would positively value. But another thing I would negatively value about myself is I know I'm still at the age of 40-something, not as self-confident as I would like to be. No, so
well, obviously, because you said something instead of. Well, obviously, I mean, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You said you're 40-something. If you were more self-confident, you said 40, whatever.
Yeah, this is true. 40, actually.
Okay.
So I can say I know. So I can be evaluative about myself, and I suppose the code would be reflective.
Yeah.
But it does sort of give a solidity to the self, which I think, if you can sort of see yourself as a spectrum of things, you're made up of this, almost like a product, and you then say, I like those bits and I don't like those bits and I'm neutral about those. It gives it a fixity, which I think is not really how we are. I mean, we're not as, we're not just like, I don't know, balls of...
Yeah. It kind of negates the idea of constructing identity in interaction.
I'm not concerned about how we actually are. I'm concerned with whose interest it is for me to divide myself up and think some parts are bad and some parts are good.
So what would be your alternative description? Alternative model?
I wouldn't have an alternative description, but I would recognize that these descriptions of identity are not objective and neutral like they are being presented here, but instead in the interest of some structural understanding.
Okay.
And I think recognising that it's not all about the individual, because I think that view of identity is really not useful, but to see identity as a much more social thing than this is seen, and a less fixed thing. So both more social and less fixed.
Andrew, did you put that up there for a reason?
I was just thinking of you portioning your stuff into various bits.
Yeah, I mean that, when I saw that,
it is, but I don't like it. I remember looking at it and not liking it.
I didn't like that either.
Because that is a fixed thing. I mean, that's exactly, cutting up the cake and saying, I'm a bit of this and I'm a bit of this.
Yeah,
as if we were the same all the time, as if we were stable.
Yeah.
We were talking about that this morning as well.
Yeah, we were. So what?
We were talking about that.
But I don't like this because there are various implications to...
We're talking about the circle.
Schwartz's value constructs and the structured relationship. Because this would appear, it's a two-dimensional model, it's in paper format, you can't really represent three dimensions very well. But hedonism being opposite both conservatism and loyalty is problematic for two reasons. I know a lot of people who, for fun, do the same things. That would be the very definition of conservatism. They go to the same place every year on holiday during the same 2 weeks and go, and for them that is fun. Okay. And also, hedonism being separate from loyalty, fun being opposite from loyalty, and this might be because fun and you've got loyalty here. That's problematic for somebody who's still realising this is intensely Western cultural, who is very happily within and monogamous with my wife. So fun and loyalty shouldn't be opposite, because I can have fun with my wife and still be loyal, and that's about as indelicate as I'm going to be. He says, therefore, I'm projecting that you would actually get the implicative there. But you understand what I'm saying here?
I don't understand why conformity and tradition are in the same slice.
Well, I think the problem that you're both addressing, to me, is that maybe you've crystallised what my problem with that is that you can't separate those things out anyway, can you? Because anybody that looks at it is going to come up with a different thing and say, well, that should be in there, or those overlap, or... So this seems to be... I haven't read Schwartz, but it's as if Schwartz has kind of just come up with his take on what he thinks constitutes somebody's identity, but...
I don't know whether you've actually seen these marketing HR tools whereby you fill in these
Immediately cynical.
yeah, I mean that you fill in
Exactly.
These, I mean,
it's that kind of
capitalism,
psychological.
the psychological
trap.
evaluation. I mean, these are simply
Yeah, pigeonholing.
Schwartz seems to have just taken on those psychological evaluations, which are about actually fitting people into.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm sure this is a major. I'm sure there's a major
Yeah.
US recruiting company which is probably using
Okay,
this.
which relates to
Absolutely.
Jodie's point of
Yeah, yeah.
Of capitalism.
Testing is massively commercial.
Yeah.
Say again.
Psychometric testing is
Yeah.
massively
Yeah, and that's
Yeah.
very
Exactly.
much part of this. I just, worry if we start taking on that view of the self,
Yeah.
which is very much about fitting people square pegs into round holes.
Your rainbow, your spectrum metaphor, I started liking, then suddenly thought, actually that's not right, because your spectrum is effectively little packets of
Yeah.
colour which have to be not
Yeah.
next to other packets of
Yeah.
colour,
Mm.
like this. And can't I
No,
be powerfully
but a
self-directed?
spectrum
But I
merging
mean,
is
what's-
very hard to draw boundaries.
Or
Yeah.
can't I
Yeah.
so it
achieve
allows
this?
Yeah.
more flow, which this
Yeah.
doesn't.
Yeah, because self-enhancement opposite self-transcendence. Transcendence. If you enhance yourself, then aren't you ultimately keep doing that? You will essentially transcend what you were. So, I mean, that should be more like a toilet roll tube with conservatism and openness to change, and everything else.
Maybe to meet the strip.
You call it what you want. So, but you know what I mean? It's just that some of these don't look to be that opposite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even in neutral semantic states, let
I
alone
just,
them in
I just think it's a
context.
problem with how you represent this.
Yeah.
If you actually took them apart
Yeah.
and didn't put them in a ball, didn't put
If you've
them
got a
in
bag of balls, if there were 9 little balls in a bag and each one was labelled,
Yeah.
and they were all mixing themselves up.
But maybe
So
a
what it says
ball
is-
has too many clear boundaries. I mean, maybe we need, 12 fuzzy things.
They're too specific.
So
Yeah.
what we need are 12 entities which have Velcro on them.
Yeah.
And then we reconstitute
match.
and mix and match, and they're all stuck together next to each other when at various points.
And then on the next
I
one,
will-
the next
I
one,
will
you-
find
I
a
love the
better
fact that I
metaphor.
complain about
So-
capitalism
so
when Derek comes
it'll
up with a product.
That is worrying. That is worrying from a Western. You and I, if we ever decide to leave academia, we need to go into business.
But it is, again, the fact that the social dimension is gone here. It's just, again, back
Yeah.
to the individual and their cake, which they slice in whichever way they want.
Yeah.
You
And the
can have this piece of
interactional aspect of it is
Yeah.
gone, isn't
Yeah.
it? Which is back to your point about dynamism and,
it. Yeah.
and construction of identity.
One thing to get back to the distinction between the identity and the face stuff. One thing that I wrote down one large portion of this paper, and it's on. And I'll find it. It's on page 640. So, 640. This one. This quote of Campbell's. The self-concept is a multifaceted, dynamic construal that contains beliefs about one's attributes, as well as episodic and semantic memories about the self. And the thing I liked, which is very different to the self, to the face stuff, is the memories
Yeah.
of.
Yeah.
That is a large constitutive part.
Yeah.
Whether they are true memories or false memories.
Yeah,
So I suspect all-
sorry, what's your point? Are you challenging this, or is
No,
it?
no.
All right.
I'm going with this and saying, and that's not. It's because we said face is only, if you take Marina's point, face only exists in the moment in the interaction.
Yeah, which I disagree with,
I
because
disagree.
I disagree entirely, because you have face expectations, and these
Yeah.
must be based on
memories.
episodic memory of the last few or all of the interactions you've actually had with an individual. And so, whilst I agree that face is only changed in interaction, I'm not suggesting in Goffman terms that we have face, but I am saying we have face expectations. And we can be offended if we walk into enter a situation or cue a schema, in any particular schema, and our face is in the interaction is pitched lower than what we find acceptable. And for me, I'm willing to. This could be a bit of a dodge where I'm basically trying to marry up a number of different things. But ever the diplomat in some ways, and trying to basically find a way forward. And so ultimately, it's face expectations we have, yes, but face is only changed and constituted and changed in interaction. I think that would be my current position.
Mm.
So ultimately, yes, I like that quotation.
I also wondered about another thing in relation to identity. Going back to the cake metaphor, whether we always clearly know what we are. Because I think for a lot of the time we don't.
Mm.
You know, this assumes that we know what we are. I was just thinking of say, for example, I was just thinking of a friend of mine who, if push came to shove, she would identify as lesbian, but she doesn't actually sleep with women. And I think, you know, there's that sense in which, and she has had heterosexual relationships as well. Now, this type of view of identity assumes that you're one thing or another.
Mm. Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think there are lots of people who are sort of, in some ways, she doesn't bother to say what she is most of the time. And she doesn't know what she is, and it's not salient.
Not relevant to label it.
Yeah, most of the time it isn't, but if someone says, you know, are you gay or
Forced her to
straight?
label it.
But it's very difficult on a lot of identity things, I mean on some of them anyway, to just sort of say, yes, I am this rather than that.
It is.
But on others, you are clearly labelled as this rather than that. I mean, I think it's the variability of it which is not being grasped here. You know, there are some things that you can choose to be, or you don't know what you are, and there are other things which you are assigned an identity.
It also depends what's relevant at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's this notion of identity politics, the politics of identity. And again, I think that's something that isn't, that Spencer-Oatey doesn't engage with. And I just picked up on 642 with her bullet points. Yeah. I guess this is Simon again. A number of functions of identity. And the implication is that, you know, there's three things that identity helps you do.
Pretty highlighted.
So identity helps you do this thing, then it helps you do another thing, and then it helps you do another thing. But there's no ways in which identity might actually be something that constrains you, or something that socially controls you, or that forces you into a category like your friend was in, where perhaps to make that choice is to implicate her in a way that she would prefer not to make that choice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very individualistic kind of view, isn't it? She's got
in my mind, overly affirmative, overly positive. Identity is a very, very useful thing.
Yeah.
Isn't it good that we have it?
Yeah, because it's identity helping all the time.
Yeah. I mean, the many facets of the third bullet point, the many facets of identity help provide people with self-respect and self-esteem. Not necessarily. Not if somebody's saying, well, what are you, gay or straight?
Yeah.
You know, oh, are you conflicted?
Yeah.
No, I'm not conflicted.
So if she is at a gay club or something like that, and she didn't actually want to be gay in the way that other people were being gay, then that might be a real problem.
Yeah.
You know, well then how is it that you're calling yourself gay if you're not sleeping with women and doing X, Y, and Z? So
yeah,
I've got a friend actually who she is a lesbian. She like openly labels herself as that, but whenever she goes into like gay clubs, nobody believes that she is, because she's a very girly girl. She has like long hair, and she doesn't adhere to, I suppose, the stereotype of. So from like, you know, people looking at her outwardly, because they would not label her as one of them because of the way she acts and everything else about her identity, they don't believe that is a sexual orientation. So.
Yeah, and so there was an assumption around identity there that lesbian equals butch. And
by the straight community.
No,
by the lesbian community as well, because it's the lesbians in there that are saying that she can't be.
But it's a whole concept of lipstick lesbian.
Yeah, I mean,
but then very often that's very negatively
I suppose that's
seen.
Yeah, so are we therefore talking about attributes which are in terms of prototypicality, you know, so, and she doesn't have the prototypical, within the community seen as prototypical attributes for her to be within the centre of that, and therefore accepted, you know, carte blanche as lesbian, you see what I mean? So if she doesn't have many or any of those attributes from their perspective, then she's not part of the group and therefore might be viewed negatively, you see what I mean? So prototypicality might be one way forward.
It's like this thing I was saying about earlier, which you can listen to or not, but about kind of like a group as a super individual, which kind of has characteristics of human traits attributed to it. So I mean, and that's a good example, like where even the in-group members are kind of seeing that everyone should fit this kind of prototypical identity, and this actual insider isn't fitting identity, and they're kind of pushing her out. And
even though she does have the main thing that characterises them is the sexual orientation, but it's because of all the other things that she's not allowed as part of the...
Well, I think necessary, but not a sufficient condition.
Yeah.
Being gay is necessary, but not sufficient.
To being gay, yeah.
Well, that I mean, we're laughing, but that might actually be what's going on there. Right?
No, I think that is.
Well, I mean...
if you're about constructing... If we get back into bundles, if it isn't as simple as isolated attributes, that you buy into a package...
Yeah.
Right, so I don't know. When you're a Mac user, we can all get out our Macs and our iPhones and our iPods and whatever else is. And when you're I'm not going to extend this metaphor too long, but you buy into bundles.
Can I just bookmark back to my previous comment about capitalism?
Yeah.
Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think
it happens.
I think it's
But I guess my point is it's not apolitical. You know, it is but this is presented as if it weren't. This is presented as if identity is essential.
Let's just pretend that it was not represented in that way, and then put that aside. The way it's actually been written is as an irrelevance. And
I wouldn't want to do that because I think there's more at stake. You see what I mean? I think to say this is what identity is, you know, it happens to be capitalist, but oh well, then silences any other discussion of other ways in which things could be structured. And so to me, the way it's written can't be separated out from what's actually being presented. So, okay, I'm not going to write this in a sort of capitalist way, but identity is this. The second to me you say identity is this, without recognizing that it fits within a structure to say identity is this. It's part of the problem, not part of the solution. Oh, I didn't mean to have the final word on that.
But I think you know, it is the case that if we accept this very atomized, individualistic notion of identity, we're also buying into other views of society, and that maybe we have to take a step back from that and say, okay, if that's not what we want, then what could we do to provide a different framework within which to see identity? Because I don't find this a particularly helpful way of looking at identity. I couldn't use it. And I think also I couldn't use the notion of face if it was, you know, very similar to identity in a way. It has made me rethink the notion of face very much. Because I think that is somehow, I mean, that has always been a more social thing. It's always been described in more social terms than identity.
Well, which again goes back to the business about constructing yourself.
Yeah.
Is that face, to me, that it is about the social self and how you appear, how you are in that construction, in interaction. Whereas identity does seem to be much more individual anyway. Or perhaps individual isn't the right word. It's psychological, I suppose, rather than social and constructed. No, it is constructed, but psychological rather than social.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Relational would argue that notion of an individualistic identity is something which is only formed through social relations. So it is very much already social.
Yeah.
In that it is that dialogic.
Yeah.
But it has some element, not permanence, that isn't the right word, but it exists outside immediate interaction. You're saying when you go out the room, you don't
have no identity.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
there's no one in
but
the corridor.
But it is partly a history of all those interactions.
Yeah.
But again, that's politically motivated. So when Foucault talks about the fact that the heterosexual becomes a personage in the 19th century, sudden with a history, it would have been, yes, perhaps you had homosexual encounters, but you weren't a personage. You were someone who had some of this experience with some type of sex and other types of experience with other types of sex. In the 19th century, that became an identity. You have a history at that point.
An identity as kind of a little slot
Indeed.
that you go in, that you fit into.
Indeed, and then you are then able to confess your identity as a homosexual. And so I think Cameron and Kulik argue that they sort of relate that to being being someone who visits prostitutes. You might have visited one or two prostitutes in your life, but that isn't part of your identity. You are not a client, as it were. You don't have a history that you can then confess. When did you first realize that you were a client? When did you don't have that as part of your episodic memory and your identity that leaves with you when you leave the room. So there are certain aspects of identity that are culturally relevant and historically variable that leave with you when you leave the room, and others that you don't even think of in that way.
But then we are a product of our social context in that sense, that that most, probably all of us have grown up within Western democracy, and that inevitably is going to shape the way that we think about the world.
Yes.
So you can't escape that.
No, but you can be honest about the fact that it is politically motivated, which I think this isn't being honest about. I think this is.
Can you leave anything that's not actually waste yet? So some of those are clean cuts. Can you?
Thank you.
Thanks. I think this is a transition, which is a shame, because one of the things that I wanted to potentially talk about, even though she only devotes about, I don't know, 74 is the notion of what counts as reasonable data, whether it's discourse only or whether it's discourse and post-event comments.
Well, I found that of particular interest because of this paper that I've just written. That, up until now, I've been.
Can you leave?
Thank you.
For the sake of it, can you leave those? Are those two options going somewhere else, or okay? I do that to make sure that you get what you paid for. Don't want taking away stuff just because we haven't used it yet.
Absolutely, there's a good half a pack of biscuits there.
Well, those are his anyway, so.
Oh, well.
Yeah, sorry.
She would have taken them anyway.
Post-event what's it? Because you're.
Well, because I've always used naturally occurring video and audio recorded interactions, and it's only this last paper that I've written where I've used.
Interview.
No, they're not interviews. Well, I have, last two post-interviews I've used recently with this intercultural data, and also, as I mentioned before, the kind of, not exactly anecdotes, but they're reported conversations, put it that way. And so, to some extent, I'm trying to find where she says this.
It doesn't raise until the bottom of page 653.
Yeah.
I have some sympathy with what she's saying about the value of Posthoc interviews. To what extent is it necessary to obtain people's evaluative reactions? Post-event comments can then be both important and enlightening. I mean, I think there are problems with that as well. I don't think it should be the only source of data.
It's triangulation, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think the problem is maybe if you're involved in the interaction, then maybe you shouldn't be involved in the post-event interview. I mean, I think those two things maybe need to be separate. Because I was concerned with her data. I think she's involved in the data, and then she asks them questions afterwards. You know, how did you feel about that? Well, if you're involved, they're sort of. I think it gets too complicated, doesn't it?
I think it depends what value you give to that as well, doesn't it? I think as long as you recognise that what they say about what they meant is not necessarily. I still think that you have to look at what. And this is what I ended up doing with my data, is I looked at what people actually did in the interaction and focused on that as, you know, what bits of meaning were taken up in the next turn and that kind of thing. And then maybe if there's some other additional information about what they happen to say about it afterwards, and if that kind of confirms that, then maybe that's okay. But if you're just relying on people's post-hoc interpretations of what they meant, then that is much more suspicious, much more dodgy, I would have thought. But this question of to what extent is it necessary to obtain people's evaluative reactions, I think it depends what you're looking at and what you're looking for. Are you looking for? If you're looking for what people do in a situation, then I wouldn't have thought it is necessary. But if you're looking for how people feel about a situation, then it isn't.
How can you not?
Yeah. She says sometimes it's possible to access these reactions through subsequent discourse, but she doesn't actually do that with her own examples, does she? She doesn't look at the discourse. She looks at she doesn't do that moment by moment. What are people doing here? So I suppose that would be the difference with my own stuff.
Done for today.